Looking back, the signs were there. But when your life feels perfect, you don't question the cracks until you're forced to. My name is Michael Turner, 42 years old. I run my own contracting business and live in suburban Illinois. For years, my life revolved around my wife, Linda, and our son, Jacob. Linda was my rock, beautiful, supportive, and effortlessly charming. Jacob, 21, was home from college for the summer, and I couldn't have been prouder of the young man he was becoming. At least, that's what I thought. The trouble started innocently enough. Linda asked me to help her parents in Iowa with some home repairs. Their house was falling apart, and I agreed without hesitation. I spent 5 weeks there, fixing their roof, plumbing, and porch. I called Linda every night, but as the weeks passed, her voice became distant. Just tired, she'd say. Jacob avoided my calls entirely, only replying to texts with a vague busy. When I finally drove back home, I wasn't expecting fanfare, but I also wasn't expecting the hollow feeling that greeted me. I pulled into the driveway late Friday afternoon. The house looked normal, but something felt off. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. I dropped my bags in the hallway and noticed a half-full wine glass on the coffee table. Linda wasn't much of a drinker, and Jacob didn't touch alcohol. "Hello," I called out, heading upstairs. The bedroom door was ajar. Linda was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me. When she turned and saw me, she flinched. "You're home early," she said, forcing a smile. It wasn't a greeting. It was a defense mechanism. "Where's Jacob?" I asked. Her eyes flicked toward the bathroom door. Just for a second, but it was long enough. "He's out running errands," she said quickly, standing and smoothing her shirt. Her voice was tight, strained. I wanted to ask more, but something in her expression stopped me. Over the next few days, the tension in the house was unbearable. Linda avoided me, and Jacob stayed locked in his room. I tried to push down the unease, but the pieces weren't adding up. Something wasn't right, and I was determined to find out what. When you think your world is solid, you don't question the foundation. But cracks have a way of spreading, and once you notice them, you can't look away. The first real sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday night, just a few days after I'd gotten home. Linda was making dinner, grilled salmon, one of my favorites. Jacob wandered into the kitchen halfway through, grabbing a soda from the fridge without so much as a glance at me. "How's the job hunt going?" I asked, trying to keep things casual. "Fine," he muttered, staring at the floor. Linda jumped in before I could say more. "He's been helping me around the house, Mike. He's been great." She shot Jacob a look when I couldn't quite decipher. He shrugged and slouched out of the room, leaving his soda unopened on the counter. It wasn't like him to be so dismissive. Jacob had always been close to me, always eager to talk about his plans, his friends, his life. Now, he barely spoke to me. Something had changed. The next day, I caught Linda standing at the kitchen sink, staring out the window like she was miles away. Her phone was on the counter, screen lit up. A notification had just popped up, a text from Jacob. I glanced at it. Just one word. "Later." "Everything okay?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She startled, snatching the phone off the counter. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" I wanted to push, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I just nodded and left the room, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Why was Jacob texting Linda when they were both in the same house? That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the day had left me restless. Around midnight, I got up and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed Jacob's room, I heard voices. His door was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled into the hallway. I hesitated, then leaned closer. "You can't just keep avoiding him," Linda said, her voice low but urgent. Jacob's reply was muffled, but I caught enough to understand. "I'm not. He's not stupid, Mom." Mom. It was the way he said it. Too familiar. Too close. My chest tightened, and my mind raced. What the hell were they talking about? Why would Jacob need to avoid me? I waited until the voices died down before heading back to my room. Linda was already in bed, her back to me. I lay down beside her, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what I'd just heard. The next morning, I decided to confront Jacob. He was in the garage, tinkering with his old bike. "Hey," I said, leaning against the workbench. "Can we talk?" He didn't look up. "About what?" "You've been acting different. Distant. I just want to make sure everything's okay. Jacob sighed and wiped his hands on a rag. I'm fine, Dad. Just got a lot on my mind. That's not an answer. He finally met my eyes, and for a moment, I saw something, guilt, maybe, or fear. But then he looked away, shaking his head. It's nothing. Don't worry about it. Before I could press him further, Linda appeared in the doorway. Mike, I need your help with something upstairs, she said quickly, her voice tight. Jacob ducked past her without a word, leaving us alone. I stared at Linda, waiting for an explanation, but she just smiled like nothing was wrong. I started paying closer attention after that, watching them, noticing the small things. The way Linda's hand lingered on Jacob's shoulder when she passed him. The way he avoided being in the same room with me, but seemed comfortable enough around her. The way they both fell silent when I entered the room. One afternoon, while Linda was out running errands, I decided to do some investigating. I started with her phone. She was careful, too careful. Her messages were wiped clean, her call logs suspiciously empty. Jacob's old phone was my next target. I'd seen it lying around in the basement, forgotten after he upgraded a few months ago. I powered it on and scrolled through the messages. Most were mundane, conversations with friends, old group chats. But one thread caught my eye, a string of texts with no contact name, just a phone number. The messages started off innocent enough. Jacob, hey, thanks for dinner last night. Unknown anytime. It was nice, just the two of us. Jacob, yeah. Wish things were simpler. Unknown, we'll figure it out. Just keep your cool. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I knew that number. It was Linda's. That night, I didn't say anything. I sat through dinner, listening to Linda talk about her day, watching Jacob pick at his food. My appetite was gone. The knot in my stomach had grown into a boulder, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I needed proof. Real proof. So I waited, watched, and planned. By the time the weekend rolled around, the unease in my chest had turned into a full-blown storm. The more I observed Linda and Jacob, the more I felt like an outsider in my own home. The tension between them wasn't the kind of mother and son bond one used to see. It was something else, something darker. Saturday morning, I decided to test the waters. Let's have a family day, I announced over breakfast. Maybe head to the lake or grab lunch somewhere. Jacob glanced at Linda, waiting for her to answer first. She hesitated, twisting her coffee cup in her hands. I have errands to run, she said finally. Rain check. Jacob jumped in too quickly. I've got plans with a friend. A lie. I could see it in the way his eyes darted to the floor. But I let it go. For now. That afternoon, I took the opportunity to dig deeper. Linda had left her laptop on the dining table before heading out, and curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and clicked on her email. At first, there was nothing unusual. Promotional emails, PDA updates, reminders from the bank. But then I found a string of archived emails with Jacob's name in the subject line. The most recent one stopped me cold. Subject about last night. From Linda. To Jacob. We need to be more careful. He's not stupid, and I think he's starting to suspect something. Don't bring it up again unless I say so. And for God's sake, act normal. I leaned back in the chair, my head spinning. Act normal? More careful? What the hell were they talking about? I couldn't bring myself to read the rest. I felt sick, like the walls of my own house were closing in on me. The next day, I decided to set a trap. Linda had mentioned going to the farmer's market in the morning, so I told her I had a worksite meeting and left early too. In truth, I parked down the street and waited. Sure enough, as soon as I was gone, Jacob's car pulled into the driveway. He didn't stay long, maybe 15 minutes before leaving again. But it was enough. Enough to confirm that something was going on. When I got back, Linda was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables. She didn't hear me come in at first. Did Jacob stop by this morning? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Her hands froze mid-chop. Yeah, just to grab something he left here last week. What was it? She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. I don't know. A textbook or something. Her lie was so obvious it hurt. But I kept my face neutral and nodded, letting her think she'd gotten away with it. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until Linda was asleep, then went to the basement to search Jacob's things. His old phone had already given me a glimpse into whatever they were hiding, but I needed more. It didn't take long to find it. A small box shoved into the corner of a storage shelf. Inside were photos, some old, some recent. Most were innocent. Family vacations, school events, snapshots from birthdays. But one picture stood out. It was a selfie of Linda and Jacob, taken in the living room. Linda was smiling, her arm draped over his shoulder, but something about the way they were sitting, too close, too intimate, made my stomach churn. Then I noticed the timestamp. 2 weeks ago, while I was still at her parents' house. Underneath the photo was a handwritten note. Thanks for last night. I needed that. Love, L. My vision blurred with rage. I clenched the box so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every fiber of me wanted to storm into Jacob's room and demand answers, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not without confronting Linda first. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in any longer. As soon as Jacob left for class, I cornered Linda in the kitchen. Who's Elle? I asked, holding up the note. Her face paled. She tried to grab it, but I pulled back. Michael, I can explain. Don't insult me by lying again. My voice shook, but I didn't care. How long has this been going on? She looked at the floor, tears welling in her eyes. It's not what you think. Then tell me. I slammed the note onto the counter. Explain to me why my wife is writing love notes to my son. Linda broke down, sobbing into her hands. It just happened, she whispered. While you were gone. I don't know how. I don't know why. Her words felt like a knife to my chest. I staggered back, trying to process what she was saying. So it's true, I said, my voice hollow. You and Jacob? She nodded, her shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, Mike. I'm so sorry. Sorry. That's all she had to say? Sorry? I didn't speak. I couldn't. My head was spinning, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I turned and left the house, needing air, space, anything to escape the nightmare I was living. For the rest of the day, I drove aimlessly, replaying her confession over and over in my mind. The betrayal, the lies, the sheer insanity of it all. When I finally came home, the house was dark and silent. Linda was in the living room, her face red and puffy from crying. She looked up when I walked in, but I didn't say a word. I went straight upstairs, locked the bedroom door, and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that Linda had betrayed me or the fact that it was with him, my son. My own flesh and blood. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. I woke up the next morning with one thought. I needed answers. Real answers. Not the broken fragments Linda had given me. I had to face Jacob. As much as I dreaded it, as much as I wanted to bury my head in the sand and pretend none of this was happening, I couldn't. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about the rot that had infected my family, and I needed to cut it out. I waited until Jacob came home that afternoon. Linda was in the kitchen, doing her best to stay out of my way, but the tension in the house was suffocating. When Jacob walked in, I was sitting on the couch, waiting for him. Hey, he said casually, tossing his keys onto the coffee table. What's up? Sit down, I said, my voice cold. Jacob froze, glancing toward the kitchen. When he saw Linda standing by the sink, her back turned to us, his expression shifted. He looked nervous, like he knew exactly what was coming. Dad, if this is about... Sit down. He sat. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at him. Tell me the truth. How long has this been going on between you and Linda? He flinched at her name, his eyes darting to the kitchen again. Dad, Don't call me that, I snapped. You lost the right to call me that when you started sleeping with my wife. Jacob's face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he was going to cry. But instead, he dropped his head into his hands and let out a shaky breath. It wasn't supposed to happen, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It just did. How? My voice was rising now, my anger boiling over. How does something like this just happen? You're my son, Jacob. My son. And she's your mother. She's not my real mom, he shouted, his head snapping up. She's your wife. She's not my mom. And she never has been. The words hit me like a slap. Jacob wasn't wrong. Linda wasn't his biological mother. Jacob was from my first marriage, a messy relationship that had ended when he was 5. Linda had stepped in as his stepmother, And while she never insisted on being called Mom, she had been every bit the maternal figure in his life. "That doesn't make this okay," I yelled. "She raised you, Jacob. You've known her since you were a kid." He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Linda appeared in the doorway, pale and shaking. "Stop," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, Mike, stop." I turned on her, the fury I'd been holding back finally spilling out. "No, Linda, I won't stop. You're just as guilty as he is. You're the one who was supposed to protect this family, and instead, you destroyed it." Her eyes filled with tears. "I made a mistake. I know I did, but it wasn't like we planned this. It just happened. Stop saying that." I roared. "You don't accidentally sleep with someone. You don't accidentally betray your husband. You made a choice, Linda. Both of you did." For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of Linda's quiet sobs. Jacob sat motionless, his hands clenched into fists. "Why?" I asked finally, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" Linda looked at me, her face streaked with tears. "I don't know," she whispered. "You were gone, and when we got close, I didn't mean for it to go this far." Jacob spoke up, his voice thick with shame. "It started with her leaning on me when you were away. We talked, and I don't know. I didn't think it would turn into anything." He swallowed hard, his face a mask of regret. "I know I screwed up. I know I let you down. But I love her, Dad. I can't help it." The room spun. I gripped the edge of the coffee table to steady myself, his words repeating in my head like a broken record. "I love her." "You're sick," I said, shaking my head. "Both of you." Linda reached for me, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't you dare touch me." I left the house after that, needing space to breathe. I drove aimlessly for hours, the weight of their betrayal crushing me. How could they do this? How could Linda, the woman I had trusted with my heart, betray me in the worst way imaginable? And Jacob, my son, my own flesh and blood, how could he look me in the eye and tell me he loved her? By the time I returned home, it was late. Linda was waiting for me in the living room, her face drawn and pale. Jacob's car was gone, and the house was eerily quiet. "Where is he?" I asked. "He's staying with a friend tonight," she said softly. "I thought it would be better if he wasn't here." "Better for who?" I shot back. "Because it sure as hell doesn't make anything better for me." Linda flinched but didn't respond. I walked past her, heading for the stairs, but her voice stopped me. "Mike, please," she said. "Can we talk? I want to fix this." I turned slowly, staring at her in disbelief. "Fix this? You think this can be fixed? You slept with my son, Linda. How do you fix something like that?" "I love you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I made a mistake, but I love you. Please, don't give up on us." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "You don't get to play the victim here. You don't get to cry and beg for forgiveness after what you've done. You didn't just betray me. You destroyed our family." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. I walked upstairs, slammed the bedroom door shut, and locked it behind me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of Linda's muffled sobs echoing through the house. Sleep didn't come. All I could think about was how I'd been betrayed, not by a stranger or an enemy, but by the two people I loved most in the world. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house felt like a war zone the next morning. Every room carried the weight of what had happened. The walls seemed to echo with memories, now tainted by betrayal. I spent the night in the guest room, and when I came downstairs, Linda was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen. "Good morning," she said softly. I ignored her and went straight for the coffee maker. My hands were shaking as I poured myself a cup, the heat of the mug doing little to thaw the cold that had settled in my chest. "Mike," she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I don't want to hear it," I said flatly. "Not today. Not ever." Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I walked out to the backyard, needing space, air, anything to escape her suffocating presence. Jacob didn't come home that day, or the next. I didn't ask where he was, and Linda didn't offer any explanations. The silence between us was unbearable. Every time I saw her, I felt the anger boiling under my skin, threatening to spill over. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. I called my best friend, Chris, and asked him to meet me at a local bar. Chris and I had known each other since high school, and if anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was him. Chris was already at the bar when I arrived, a beer in front of him. He took one look at me and frowned. "Damn, Mike, you look like hell." "Feels worse," I muttered, sliding onto the stool next to him. We ordered a round, and before the waitress could even walk away, the words spilled out of me. "Everything, Linda, Jacob, the betrayal." Chris sat in stunned silence as I laid it all out, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger to pity. "You're kidding me," he said finally. "Jacob? Your own son?" I nodded, staring into my drink. I don't even know how to process it, man. I keep trying to figure out where I went wrong, what I missed. "Don't," Chris interrupted. "Don't you dare blame yourself for this. They're the ones who screwed up, not you." "Yeah, well, it doesn't make it hurt any less," I muttered. Chris leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I kicked Jacob out and Linda's been begging for forgiveness, but I can't even look at her without wanting to scream. And Jacob? How the hell do I even begin to fix that relationship?" Chris shook his head. "Maybe you don't. Maybe some things can't be fixed." His words hit harder than I expected. I stared at him, wondering if he was right. Could I even begin to piece my life back together? Or was this the kind of damage that couldn't be undone? When I got home that night, Linda was waiting for me in the living room. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. "Can we talk?" she asked. I didn't want to, but I nodded anyway, sinking into the chair across from her. "I know I've said this 100 times," she began, "but I'm sorry, Mike. I'm so sorry. I know I've hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for what I've done. But I need you to know, it wasn't just about you being gone. I've felt disconnected from you for a long time." I laughed bitterly. "Disconnected? So instead of talking to me about it, you decided to sleep with my son? That was your solution?" She winced. "No, of course not. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was lonely, and Jacob was there, and—" "Stop," I said, cutting her off. "Just stop. I don't want to hear your excuses. You didn't just destroy our marriage, Linda. You destroyed this family. Do you even realize what you've done?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "I do, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." "You can't make this right," I snapped. "Nothing you do will ever undo what you've done." She sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. I wanted to feel something, anger, pity, anything, but I was numb. "I'm filing for divorce," I said quietly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "Mike, no, please don't do this. We can work through this." "I know we can." I stood, my voice cold and final. "We're done, Linda. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Over the next few weeks, I began the process of untangling my life from hers. I moved into a motel temporarily, unable to stay in the house any longer. I told Jacob he wasn't welcome in my life until he was ready to own up to what he'd done. His response was silence. Friends and family found out soon enough. Reactions ranged from awkward sympathy to outright disgust. My sister, Emily, called to tell me she'd cut Linda out of her life entirely. "What she did is unforgivable," Emily said. "You deserve better." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that there was life beyond this mess, that I could rebuild and move forward. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Linda and Jacob, together. The image haunted me, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. One evening, about a month after the confrontation, I got a call from Jacob. I stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but another part of me just wanted to let it go. In the end, I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was short. "Dad, I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it. For what it's worth, I'll regret what I did for the rest of my life." I didn't know how to feel. His words sounded sincere, but sincerity couldn't erase the damage. I deleted the message and poured myself another drink, wondering if I'd ever be able to forgive him, or if I even wanted to. The next few weeks passed in a haze. I moved out of the motel and into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with cheap carpeting and noisy neighbors, but it was mine. A fresh start, or at least the closest thing I could manage. Linda had moved in with her sister after I filed for divorce. We communicated only through lawyers, and even then, the conversations were tense and bitter. She'd sent me a few emails, long rambling apologies that I couldn't bring myself to read. I'd delete them the moment they popped up in my inbox, unwilling to give her words any more power over me. Jacob, on the other hand, had disappeared. I hadn't seen or heard from him since the voicemail he left. Part of me wanted to track him down, to demand answers, but the larger part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. What could he possibly say that would make this right? One evening, I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment, nursing a beer and staring out at the city lights, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily, my sister. Emily, Mom's birthday dinner is Saturday. Are you coming? Linda won't be there. I stared at the message, torn. It had been months since I'd seen my family, and I knew they were worried about me. But the thought of sitting through small talk and forced smiles felt exhausting. Before I could overthink it, I typed back, I'll be there. The dinner was at a cozy Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and dim lighting. When I arrived, Emily greeted me with a hug, her eyes scanning my face like she was trying to gauge how I was holding up. You look good, she said, though her tone was more hopeful than certain. Thanks, I said, offering her a tight smile. The evening passed in a blur of wine and conversation. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of normalcy. My mom fussed over me. Emily cracked jokes about the joys of raising teenagers, and for a few hours, I almost forgot about the mess waiting for me back home. Almost. As I was leaving, Emily followed me out to the parking lot. I know you probably don't want to hear this, she said carefully, but Jacob called me last week. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. What did he say? He's been staying with a friend, working odd jobs. He asked if I thought you'd ever talk to him again. I looked away, my jaw tightening. I don't know if I can. Emily placed a hand on my shoulder. I'm not saying you have to forgive him, Mike. I'm just saying he's your son. And no matter what he did, that hasn't changed. Her words stayed with me long after I drove home. I poured myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. I wanted to hate Jacob. I wanted to erase him from my life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. He was my son, and that bond wasn't something I could sever, no matter how much he'd hurt me. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went to therapy. The therapist, Dr. Hayes, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a kind but firm demeanor. I told her everything, the betrayal, the anger, the guilt. I expected her to tell me what everyone else had, that I should cut them both out of my life and move on. But instead, she said something that stopped me cold. Forgiveness isn't about them, she said. It's about you. Carrying this pain around will only eat you alive. Letting it go doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what they did. It means freeing yourself from their hold over you. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But her words stuck with me. A few weeks later, I found myself standing outside a coffee shop, my hands stuffed into my jacket pockets. Across the street, Jacob was sitting at an outdoor table, fidgeting with his phone. He looked older somehow, his shoulders slumped and his face drawn with exhaustion. I almost turned around, almost walked away, but something stopped me. Maybe it was Dr. Hayes' words, or maybe it was the faint glimmer of hope that I could salvage something from the wreckage of my life. Taking a deep breath, I crossed the street. Hey, I said, standing awkwardly by the table. Jacob looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. Dad, mind if I sit? He nodded quickly, motioning to the chair across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could see the guilt written all over his face, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. I don't know what to say, he admitted finally. Then don't, I said. Just listen. He nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You broke my trust, Jacob, I said, my voice steady but firm. What you and Linda did, it's the worst thing I've ever been through. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I'm willing to try, because you're my son, and despite everything, I still love you. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he nodded, his voice breaking as he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. For everything. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." The road to recovery was long and messy. Rebuilding trust wasn't easy, and some days, the weight of the betrayal felt too heavy to bear. Linda and I finalized our divorce, and while she begged for another chance, I knew we were done. Jacob and I started meeting regularly, slowly piecing together the shattered remains of our relationship. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. 1 year later, I stood in my new backyard, flipping burgers on the grill. The apartment had been temporary. Now I had a house again, small but comfortable. Emily was sitting at the patio table, sipping a glass of wine, while Jacob helped her son set up a game of cornhole on the lawn. As I watched them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was mine, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again.